So we're looking at chapter 3 of John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. Let's think about what he means by the title of this chapter, of the ultimate sanction of the principle of utility. So there's two elements there. There's the word sanction, and there is the principle of utility. I think there's a basis for some confusion here. Here is the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. That's the principle. But to really, I think, get what Mill is saying here, we have to change it a little bit. That is, because what he's asking about here is the sanction of the principle. And we know what he means by that because he explains it. Question is often asked, and properly so, in regard to any supposed moral standard: what is its sanction? What are the motives to obey it? Okay, that's really what he means by sanction. What gives it its force and authority? What are the motives to obey it? Or more specifically, what is the source of its obligation? Whence does it derive its binding force? That is, this is an interpretation of the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, in the form of a rule. So when we think of what he's really trying to get at here, I think we can think of it, we should kind of have to transform what's there, the greatest happiness principle, which is a definition basically of right and wrong, into a kind of a command, something along the order or in the form of something like Kant's categorical imperatives. So that I think in this context, at least, the way to think of it is in this form. If I can get the thing. Of course, that's a different mood. It's an imperative. It's a rule to be followed. It certainly is very much in line. It would seem to follow naturally from the greatest happiness principle. But it's in the form of a rule. And the question is, why should we follow that rule? What gives that rule its authority over us? Why should I always do that which results in the most general happiness for all whose interests are concerned? And just to continue here, just to let his words explain it, he says, it is a necessary part of moral philosophy to provide the answer to this question. That is, given any moral rule, give me the basis for that rule, in the sense of give me the reason why I and everyone else should follow it. It is a necessary part of moral philosophy to provide the answer to this question, which, though frequently assuming the shape of an objection to the utilitarian morality, as if it had some special applicability to that above others, really arises in regard to all standards, which is, again, Mill saying, this, of course, is a problem for utilitarianism. What gives this command to do that which results in the greatest net happiness its force? Or why should I do it? Why should I follow it? This is a problem for utilitarianism, but this is a problem for any moral philosophy, right? If the basis of a moral philosophy was like what's called a divine command theory, do that which God wishes, some form of that. Well, why should I do that which God wishes? Or let's say a categorical imperative: always treat persons as ends in themselves and never as means. It makes perfect sense to say why. Why should I do that? What gives that rule any kind of special binding force over me? So it's a problem for utilitarianism, Mill says, but it's a problem for any moral philosophy that sets out the kind of standard for conduct that utilitarianism does. Could be another form. But he continues and says, it arises, in fact, whenever a person is called upon to adopt a standard or refer morality to any basis on which he has not been accustomed to rest it. And here things also get a little bit more interesting. Look at what he says here. For the customary morality, and the customary morality is the things that we learn at our mother's knee. Be a good boy, be a good girl. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't be mean to other kids. When he says the customary morality, just the things that were handed down by our community, our mothers and fathers, our elders, our teachers, just the culture in general, the things that we soak up as being the do's and don'ts of living a good life. He says, for the customary morality, that which education and opinion have consecrated is the only one which presents itself to the mind with the feeling of being in itself obligatory. And when a person is asked to believe that this morality derives its obligation from some general principle round which custom has not thrown the same halo, the assertion is to him a paradox. Now, what's the paradox? The supposed corollaries, that is the secondary principles, seem to have a more binding force than the original theorem. The superstructure seems to stand better without than with what is represented as its foundation, which is an extremely interesting thing to say. If this is the foundation, right, what Mill is saying is that kind of leaves us cold. Whereas that, or that, or that, those things seem, oh yeah, of course, of course I shouldn't be mean to other people. Of course I should be good to my friends. Of course I should give back to my community. Those are the corollaries, right? The corollaries are the things that follow from, that are secondary to the main point, the theorem. And the theorem here is, what takes the place of the theorem is that, always do that, which results in the most general happiness for all whose interests are concerned. What Mill is pointing out is something that's a psychological point. That principle, that general principle about happiness, leaves us cold because it doesn't evoke in us the same sort of natural feeling of reverence that these secondary principles do, or these secondary rules do. As he says, the principle itself, from which these other things are derived, he thinks, right? It doesn't have, as he says, the same halo around it. It hasn't been consecrated, let's say. It doesn't have the same, in our minds at least, it doesn't have the same place. So that the superstructure, as he says, seems to stand better without than with what is represented as its foundation. He says to himself, I feel that I am bound not to rob or murder, betray or deceive, but why am I bound to promote the general happiness? If my own happiness lies in something else, why may I not give that the preference? So it's an extremely interesting question that he's raised here in the latter part of this opening. Why? I mean, he's presuming that his reader is a decent person, so they're not going to rob somebody, they're not going to murder somebody, they're not going to deceive or cheat or steal from somebody. But that same decent person may say, well, what's this greatest happiness principle thing? Why should I follow that? What gives it its force? And as we'll see, it is ultimately a kind of a psychological question, right? We have a horror of murder. We have a horror of betrayal or deception. That is, we shrink at those things because we consider them low and mean and shameful. But it may be that psychologically we don't consider it low or mean or shameful to violate this. And that's kind of the problem that he leaves with. How do we consecrate this principle you might say, or what could give this principle the same psychological force, at least, that these secondary principles like these have.